All right, folks, thank you for paying really close attention to this particular part of the morning, because not only are we talking about privacy, we're going to be talking about responsible data use, which is actually what I think most of you want to know, because most of you are not in the business of giving people a lot of privacy. You're in the business of responsibly using data to help your partners execute and have the information they need to provide the reporting and the information and the services and the apps you need. So we're going to talk about how to do this without creating a media storm, without getting sued, without creating a giant kerfluffle, which obviously is a huge drag on business. I have with me a phenomenal panel. Before I introduce them, I'm going to do something more important. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Jules Polonetsky. I'm the executive director of the Future of Privacy Forum. We're an industry-supported think tank. Half of my board are the chief privacy officers generally of 80 or 90 companies, from Apple and Microsoft and Google and Yahoo and HasOffers and Weather.com and Trustee and lots of others. And then the other half are advocates and academics who appreciate the kinds of things that can be done with data but are worried and concerned about the problems of data misuse. So we work closely with HasOffers, and it's great to be able to be with you here today. Let me introduce the folks with us. The beautiful woman to my left is one of the smartest people in privacy. She is the privacy lead at Weather.com. She was the privacy lead at Home Depot. She was the privacy lead at ING, so she's played roles across the industry. Do not attribute her remarks officially to Weather.com, because she is going to give you some passionate stuff from her heart. Richard Chu is mobile lead at Trustee and is going to talk about the work they're doing and going to react to some of my questions. Aaron Weller, based here in Seattle, is one of the leaders of the PricewaterhouseCoopers privacy practice, and he's going to tell us how he and his team come across problems, identify problems, and help good companies avoid problems. And I think a lot of you know Danon Margeson, the general counsel of HasOffers. So let me tell you what's changed just of a couple of weeks ago. I think we reached this point, and I don't know if you all felt it. The Supreme Court came down with a really interesting decision. And you may not have paid close attention because it wasn't about marketing, it wasn't about apps, it was about mobile, but it was about somebody's arrested and the cops search you. Can they also search your phone without a search warrant? And typically, cops search you because they arrested you, they can search you. Can they also search your phone? And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not just like searching in the guy's pockets. Somebody's phone is this supercomputer. It's, in those early days when the Constitution was set up, searching someone's person didn't mean every thought they ever had because of what you can have today with a phone. The Supreme Court lead justice, Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice, said, if Martians came down and saw us, they would think that we all had these little plastic things that were like physically part of our bodies. They'd go back and report and describe humans as having these like electronic things welded into their bodies. And so they came out with this very strong pro-privacy decision. And some of the commentators said, the court isn't, usually all that. They usually support law enforcement. What made a big difference? And the answer was that these people, even though they're in their 60s and 70s or 80s, they have cell phones. And they personally understood the intimacy that a cell phone has. And they weren't looking at it anymore as this like theoretical thing of technology or of computers. They got that this was this incredibly personal device. And so I think we all agree that you're going to start seeing policymakers who really react when they feel it and they understand it. There's a law called the Video Privacy Protection Act. And it passed Congress in minutes. And this law passed when Justice Bork was being nominated for the court, and some smart reporter said, hey, let's go check his video records because maybe there'll be something embarrassing. And Congress said, holy cow, you can get our video rental records. And bam, we had this law pass immediately. And so these issues that are technology issues and insider issues and tech conference issues are now USA Today media issues for the average person. They're the media issues for your grandfather. They're the media issues for the Supreme Court. And so the stakes are far higher than they ever were. They're far higher than a debate that happens just at a tech conference. We've got the world paying close attention to decisions that all of you make. All right, let me throw to some of you. Let's start, before we get into the laws, right? At the end of the day, I think most of you care most, I hope, about the consumers that you interact with, right? Before you break any laws, if you chase away your customers, it doesn't matter, you don't have any. So let me start with Lal as the privacy lead at weather.com. Do people really care? I mean, we read and we complain, and obviously the Supreme Court cares, but people complain, and they go on Facebook and they go on Google and they share their photos. Do they really care? Is this a consumer issue, or is this just a media and a policy issue? You've got lots of consumers. How do you look at it?
Consumers absolutely do care, and the last thing you want to do is upset people and have them walk away from you. And we have a couple of different stories we could tell, but my dad called up. He was mad the other day because these running shoes were following him around the internet. He wanted to stop that from happening. And I said, well, that's a good thing. You love running. You care about running shoes. You should see pictures of running shoes. I said, wouldn't you rather see that than pictures of women's underwear? And he said, oh, no, I'd much rather see pictures of women's underwear. But the point is really, as the points that the other panelists have made, is consumers want to have choice and transparency. At weather, we had a lot of consumer complaints because the app would say it was raining or not raining, and people were annoyed that they couldn't respond, that they couldn't say, you know, it's raining where I am, and here's a picture of it. And so we changed the app and we allow people to do that. So you can do a weather check-in and you can say what it is. And guess what? That helps us increase our forecasting models. So it's a win-win for everybody. The consumer gets to weigh in. Pass it to other people to see what they think.
Well, so let me say this. We heard the consumer wants to weigh in. So we're in Seattle. We're in the home of Amazon. I confess, I bought 50 Shades of Grey a couple of months ago. I wanted to see what the big fuss was all about. How is this kinky kind of thing suddenly like, you know, global news? It was scientific research. And now every time I'm on Amazon, they're showing me all kinds of other softcore porn. And everywhere else, everybody's worried about, you know, hey, if you do behavioral ads, make sure you don't do sensitive things, don't do creepy things. Target got beat up, right, for sending coupons that, you know, disclosed that somebody was pregnant, and everybody started critiquing them. And Amazon is like, hey, do you want some more of that porn? How do they do it? I feel like I'm in control, right? I feel like I could clear it. I could say that wasn't mine. And I get that they're doing it for me, right? I get that they're there. They've set a stage. They've set the tone. And so is it privacy, or is it letting me know that they're not showing me the running shoes because they want to show me the running shoes? They're showing me what they really think I like. And so they've turned it to control. Was that fair?
I think that is fair, and I think we should transition this model into the ad model. Like, if I don't want to see running shoes anymore, I ought to be able to say, I don't want to see this. And privacy is not just about keeping everything secret. It's about using the data. So wouldn't you get more information by saying, why don't you want to see the running shoes anymore? Well, I bought them, or I don't like this color, or, you know, I'd like to see them in a different color rather than this. Or guess what? I just don't want to see this particular thing anymore. And Amazon's figured that out. Like, my best friend is gay, and I bought him some cool presents for his birthday. So just like what Jules was saying. So I kept getting this like weird feed on Amazon. It allows you to go in and fix it and change it and remove that from the algorithm that you're seeing stuff. And so you should be able to do the same stuff with ads. Like, we get a lot of complaints from people on weather because they don't want to see ball of spiders. They don't want to see another kid dying in a car. And I really think you could improve that video content selection by going into, say, I mean, Google does this, a bunch of, you know, Axiom does this, where you can go in and you can see, what are you making decisions about when you send me stuff? And so you go in and you say, like, Google thought I was a guy. At one point, they thought I was a woman who was 24, probably because I was looking up Prince George pictures. I mean, whatever it is, you can go in and you can change it. And then you can see spider ball or not spider ball, or you can see more positive content based on what you say. And of course, we know people lie and that they claim they don't want to see drunk guy eaten by snake, but that's one of the all-time, you know, highest Weather Channel things. So when I ask you in a user group, do you just want to see weather when you come to weather, people say, of course, all I really want is the forecast. Well, we know that people are not looking at just that.
So how can we give users control on mobile? On the web, some of the big companies have these ad preference managers. Facebook famously just announced that they're going to create one. Mobile, we've got to deal with the fact that the platforms play some of the role in giving people choices. The industry self-regulatory programs and icons on ads that take you to opt-out cookies, give you some control. Apps and mobile web are in different environments. Richard, how has Trustee tried to struggle with this notion that if we give people some better feeling of being in control, will satisfy their concerns?
Yeah, I think we talked about privacy. Earlier we talked about the transparency and the control. I think the other things, Drew, as you mentioned, that obviously before we have that, you got to actually have some sort of notice so people understand what they can do, how they can do that. And particularly in the mobile environment, the form factor is so small compared to desktop. I think I guess depends on sort of where you start. From publisher perspective, there's a couple of ways you can do that. And obviously from the advertiser brand perspective, there are a number of things you can do that as well. So we worked with a number of publishers, including actually Weather Channel, make sure, that you set the right privacy policy from design perspective. You only connect information that actually really useful from a service provider content perspective. And obviously there are aspects from monetization, advertising, not only yourself, but also your partner, how you actually kind of engage that, connect information you only need. So there are a set of notice, choice, transparency you can build into your app, right? And one of the examples that we work with EA app that when you have app setting, so there's a private setting as part of the app setting, that the consumer can go and make choices. So that's one aspect. Then the other aspect, Drew, as you talked about, I guess for the most part, that when you run the advertising on app, on mobile web for that matter, that a lot of target advertising, and you have the industry standard, what we call the ad choice, essentially policy set by DAA, so everybody in the ad ecosystem really follow the guideline, provide the ad choice not only for desktop but also mobile environment, whether it's actually mobile app or web. When the consumer click the ad choice icon, they have the right and can raise their hand and tell that this is something they are okay, or this is something they actually rather opt out, not to be tracked, not to be targeted based on their preference. So I think that's kind of the starting point, and people understand that's something they can really do as a notice. And obviously there are a lot more work need to be done in terms of how you educate consumer, right? How you actually get them know that's something they should be able doing, and the user experience, many other things. But that's a good starting point.
So we want to give the consumer some control and transparency. We think that'll alleviate their concerns. We have an industry self-regulatory program. If the ads are behavioral, if the ads are targeted based on cross-app activity or cross-web activity, the major trade groups have agreed and have well rolled out on the web and are getting close to rolling out in mobile the obligation, and I say obligation because they've asked the Better Business Bureau to enforce this. So if you're out there puttering around and you're like, I'm not a big player, I don't want to pay for it, they've got the Better Business Bureau puttering around looking for ads that appear to be targeted, and then they write you a nasty letter, which they make public, that says, hey, you're not following the guidelines that your trade group signed up to, and it can lead to some unpleasant. So we've got a self-regulatory environment that's starting to roll out in mobile if you do behavioral or if you use location. So let's hold that in mind. So let's go to the law, because self-regulation is important, treating consumers right is important. At the end of the day, what's the law that governs what we're doing? So as you probably know, in the US we have a sectoral approach, right? We have health privacy law, we have credit law, we have special laws for kids. We don't have a general privacy law, right? Caveat, in California, you've got to have a privacy policy. And most of us know that you've got to have a privacy policy. Our partners expect it. And when you put up a privacy policy, what happens? Dana, is that now a nice policy that you need to follow? Does it have the effect of law once you put those words there? The FTC can now step in. Take it from there.
Yeah, so the privacy policy is important because you are making representations about what you are going to be doing with user data. And so if you are misrepresenting to the consumer what you're doing with their data, the FTC does have the right to step in and enforce your privacy policy against you, so to speak. So it's important to be careful with your privacy policy and what you're saying in there. One thing I wanted to pick up on from what Lel and Rich were talking about is how important this user trust and user choice is. And I think we all acknowledge, everybody in the room probably, that users do care about privacy. They want to know what their advertisers and sites that they're visiting are doing with their data. So it's really important for, so quote unquote, third parties, of which we're sort of grouped in with, but as I'll explain, I think we're slightly different. It's really important that they respect that relationship between the consumer and the advertiser slash developer slash website, and stay out of the way with the data. So what we've done at Has Offers is, we don't do anything with the advertiser's data except what they ask us to do. It's completely theirs, and in fact, if they stop working with us, they can take the data with them. So that's a really big value that we add to the ecosystem as an unbiased player, since we do not monetize that data in any way. We also spend a lot of time thinking about things like COPPA and helping ourselves be compliant, which we are, but then also helping our customers remain compliant. And some other interesting side things, like we created the first effective mobile opt-out page for online ad tracking, and we have custom user data retention policies. So in other words, if you want to delete data on our system after 6 months by default, you can set that up with us. So we, as a quote-unquote third party, I would call us more of a technology provider, but as that intermediary, we really try and respect that user relationship with the website or advertiser.
So Dana mentioned COPPA, the kids' privacy law, which many of you may not have had to worry about for many years if you actually didn't register people. If you just were doing tracking, if you were just an ad network, if you just had a free app, you probably didn't have to worry about COPPA. The FTC didn't like the fact that many of those apps or many of those mobile sites were doing behavioral advertising. They think that that's wrong when it's targeted kids. But they had no way of getting at that. They would have had to pass a new law. So what they did is they said, you know what? We have the right to decide what is personal under COPPA. So usually you think just the name is personal. The FTC said, we are going to consider tracking a kid across apps or across sites, tracking an IP, tracking an identifier, for the purpose of something like behavioral ads, for something that is for your purpose as opposed to the first party purpose of the site. That's personal. So guess what? You now need permission from mom and dad, which you got to figure out how to get. So all of a sudden, lots of apps who didn't worry about it, I just have ads, no big deal, but had cartoony things, were aimed at kids, had something educational, suddenly are under this law, which has a $15,000 penalty per kid. So you've got, X thousand of people, it becomes a pretty big and ugly penalty. That doesn't mean you can't track. It means you need to understand who you're working with and that any tracking respects your rules. Like, I'm just using it maybe for ad attribution, for attributing downloads, but I'm not using it for behavioral advertising, because if I'm aimed at kids, I now can't do that without parental permission. Let's switch for a second to the platforms, right? We've got to worry about consumers, we've got to worry about self-regulation, we've got to worry about the FTC and the attorney generals, but we also do business on platforms. As we all know, for those who do business on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, the platforms take their rules seriously, they enforce them, they make a lot of noise about them. Aaron, from your perspective, tell us a bit about what it takes to comply with the platform rules, how people ought to be dealing and interacting with that.
Yeah, so increasingly the ecosystem, as we all know, is really complicated, and I think the platforms are looking at taking some of the responsibilities from what they say in their privacy policies to the user and making sure that that flows all the way through the back-end pieces that the user doesn't really see. So we've been involved in a number of pieces of work where we're working with the platform and saying, why don't we look at what's actually in your contract with the companies that you work with, whether you're a third party or a technology platform. Let's look at what we said when we were actually going to hand over this data that we're going to be using for advertising, and then let's make sure that everyone else that's working with this data is playing by the same rules and the same commitments that we gave to our users when we collected the data in the first place. So what we're seeing is that a lot of the platforms now are going out to the other parties that they work with and saying, hey, we have this contract in place with you. It has these 10 things in it. We actually expect you to do these 10 things. Are we going to send someone like us or some other third-party auditor or reviewer in to come and make sure you're doing those things? And I think that oftentimes what we're seeing is that there can be a disconnect between the lawyers who actually review that contract in the first place and sign it, and then the engineers who are working on actually implementing those terms and conditions into the product. And sometimes when you get those disconnects, you end up with, we said we were going to do this, but actually the engineers never understood that and never put it in the product in the first place. So you then end up in problems where the platform at that point gets pretty unhappy, and then you try and work through, well, how do we go back and re-architect this thing that we built in good faith to do what we intended to do, but it's just not inconsistent with the contract that we signed. So I think we're going to see more of this as the platforms, as you were saying, that they start to kind of tighten that crank a bit and get a bit more sophisticated about what should everyone be doing. And as we realize there's, as I think all of us have said, there are some things that you do that are really, the industry and consumers increasingly expect them to be done. And we need to make sure that even if you're a startup, that you're kind of building those things in right from the start, because it's a lot harder to add them in later.
And I can tell you this, we work very closely with the chief privacy officers of most of the platforms. And when they look at their future, right, their major future strategies are, how is my iPhone going to be the remote control for every service in my home, right? How is my phone going to be used with my platform for mobile payments? They need people to be incredibly comfortable that what happens when you work with an app, what happens when you log in with Facebook, when you're using their systems, they're looking to be in our bodies, right? They're looking to be embedded in our cars, where mission critical stuff will be dependent on them. It's not just, hey, I accidentally shared this picture that I didn't expect to post. And so they're doubling down because for them, making sure their users trust them and their ecosystem is how they get to their next generation. They want to support app developers, they want to support ads, but it's automobiles, it's home control systems, it's personal health data. It's an entire universe where you don't get to play unless people are comfortable that that kind of information can be there. Question for Lal. So is this all personal anyway, right? A lot of what we're talking about here may not be a name, it might be an IDFA, it might be a hashed device identifier, it might be a MAC address, it might be a cookie. Are these legally personal? Do consumers understand the difference? We had a lot of people talking global. The Europeans, how do they look at whether or not tracking anonymously maybe your father and deciding that he likes shoes because he's been at several shoe sites, nobody knows his name? Are they targeting him personally, and does it matter?
That's an enormous question, and I think the biggest fallacy is that people have agreed on what personally identifiable information is. My biggest pet peeve is when somebody comes to me and says, oh, well, I've already decided this isn't PII, so I don't need to talk to you about it. That's probably the stupidest thing that anybody can say, so please don't say that. The way that the Europeans look at it is if you can figure out who somebody is, then it's personally identifiable. And there are all of these rules that kind of show, it took me 8 seconds to find you. It took me 8 seconds to figure out who you were, and I only had a little bit of information on you. So there are two relatively new laws, both in California and Florida, where username and or email and combined with some kind of password or security question information that allows you to get into their account, that's considered a security breach. So when you're pulling in username and password or username and a security question into your app, it's not like just banking apps have to worry about that. Everybody has to worry about that now. And guess what? It is incredibly expensive. It's $2 a person just to send a letter to somebody to talk about a data breach. I mean, look at Target. The estimate is $200 a person. So you really need to look at, it's not just anonymous, and I just wanted to follow up on Jules' VPPA comment. The reason the VPPA, the Video Privacy Protection Act, is scary is because there's a private right of action, meaning that an individual or a class action plaintiff's firm can sue you, and it's $2,500 per person. And it includes the name of the video and if I can personally identify you. So go Google Hulu and Comcast and Facebook, and that was really scary for a lot of us because nobody thought, ComScore? Like, why was ComScore involved in that? Why was Facebook involved in that? And they ended up dismissing it, but for really kind of crazy reasons. So we as an industry need to figure this out. We need to do a better job of explaining to consumers what information is collected and what we're doing with it and how it doesn't cause identity theft to try to serve you an ad about sneakers. But what pays into that and helps people feel better about it is transparency, is consent, is user choice. So that's what you need to think about building in. And I'll just say one more thing quickly. The reason this stuff is scary to people, the reason data is scary to people is for two reasons. And it's historical stuff, and if you get this in your head, it helps you think through what you should and shouldn't do. So in the 60s and 70s, banks were not giving loans to minorities because they were in this area that they had redlined. And so they were giving loans to whites and they weren't giving loans to blacks and to other minorities. And it's called redlining and reverse redlining. People weren't getting jobs, weren't getting apartments, weren't getting insurance because there was this big bad database out there that had some negative thing about them. So now if you sign up for a job and they say, sorry, we're not going to hire you, your background check says you're an axe murderer, you can say, that's not me, that's my cousin Bob. So those things are really important, and it comes out in behavioral advertising. And if you look at ftc.gov and the other things the FTC has talked about, they're saying, so you're serving an ad to somebody based on race, based on age, based on where they're located. Are you discriminating against them in some way? Do black gay men get an ad that's more expensive, or they don't get the sale ads than some other group? And that's why you need to pay attention, because that sucks and it's not fair. And that's what the FTC goes after, is this deceptive in some way? So you really need to think about the effect that the ad has and make sure that it's not doing those sorts of things.
All right. Anything you heard didn't make sense? Anything you want to ask and say, hey, how come that's working like that? Or how is it possible for me to link devices across things, given what you said? To the floor to you guys for questions. You've got thousands of dollars of legal talent here. Let me ask this question as you all ponder yours. How does anyone think iOS 8, right? You know, iOS 8, the beta that I think will be out in a couple of days, may have some interesting examples. Apple has said that they're going to start requiring developers who ask for permissions to actually say a little something about why and what you're going to do with that permission. So instead of simply saying, for instance, can I have location, and then not saying anything else, you'll need to say why and where you need location. So if you're a mapping app, okay, cool. But if you probably are using location perhaps for ad targeting or for other purposes, you may need, we haven't seen the UI yet, but they've made it very clear that they're going to be requiring sort of a just-in-time, more transparent dialogue. So I don't know if anybody started preparing for that yet, started looking at that. Probably you'll see, maybe a little bit of visibility in that when the beta comes up. Lael, have you started looking at that yet?
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about being a weather channel is I need a precise location. So, but it's interesting too, because I can't tell you what the weather is if you don't tell me where you are. It's harder for other people because they don't have as close a way to explain that. They don't have a way to do it. So there are all kinds of interesting lawsuits of people collecting data and not using it. And if you can give some consumer benefit to the person, then they're more likely to want to give you that information. Like I have the panel app on my phone, and I drive around, and then it sends me emails, and it says, when you went to this big mall, what did you buy? What store did you go to? And then I tell them. I happily tell them because I get points, and the points leads to discounts. So, and the FTC has said this is a great thing. You have consent, you have consumer interaction. The consumers are getting some kind of benefit from what you're doing. Like I love Waze. I will tell Waze all day long where I am because they tell me where the cops are. They tell me when an accident is coming up. And the other wonderful thing about it too is they've got that passenger thing on there. So it says, yes, absolutely, I'm a passenger. So hopefully if I hit the car in front of me, I don't end up suing Google. But there are all those things that you should be thinking about and putting into your apps. And I definitely think precise location, especially with children, is super scary because obviously you don't want somebody getting that information and then hunting somebody down and killing them. So obviously personal safety comes into this as well.
And I think Lael kind of to the point you were making, it's good because we're going to go back and think, why are we collecting this information in the first place? Because as you can imagine, the cheapest information to protect is the stuff you never collect in the first place. So I think oftentimes we've seen where organizations have said, well, we might use this in the future. Let's just collect it, and then when we get to it, we'll come up with an idea for using it. And I think this is going to force the real thinking as to why are we collecting this stuff in the first place. My best example of this is with if you go to like Jack Daniel's website. A few years ago they used to ask, what's your birth date, before you could get into the website. Now all they do is they say, are you 21, yes or no? So now they're not collecting this birth date. Whatever they were doing with it or tying it back to you, we don't know. But now they don't have to worry about any of that stuff anymore. So thinking about collecting the minimum amount of data for what you need to use is going to save you a lot of money in the long run as well.
Question in the back from Craig Spiesel of the Online Trust Alliance, a Seattle-based organization that does a lot of interesting security and privacy work. Craig formerly worked at Microsoft, where he played a lead role in all kinds of privacy and security issues around the IE browser. Craig, what is your question?
I have no idea now. A great discussion, and I think obviously we talk about the regulation, but the landscape's rapidly changing. There's the Location Privacy Act that's been introduced. And I think I'd like to kind of just get your thoughts. Compliance and working within the legal framework is really the minimum amount. And really what I'd like to kind of get your feedback on the stewardship. What's the right things to be doing so we don't get that creep factor? As we're talking about facial recognition, we're talking about retail data collection of your mobile or physical location. So where not should we be from a compliance perspective, but my question is, where should you be going from a stewardship best practice to make privacy and security part of your brand value proposition?
Who wants to take that? Danon.
Well, I think it's important for everybody in this room to think about, again, the relationship with the end user and the consumer, and really think about what they want. What's going to support the long-term health of the ecosystem? Because if the ecosystem survives and consumers are okay with what we're doing, then we'll all make a lot of money and be around for a lot longer than if we're kind of sneakily doing it through the back door, and then they read something in the Wall Street Journal that freaks them out. So I think continuing to maintain the dialogue with consumers is really important, and having best actors in the room together talking about what we can do to help support the ecosystem long term is going to add a lot of value.
Yeah, and having people, when you're thinking through new ideas, having people who aren't kind of in the industry giving their feedback as well is really important, because the number of times that someone will say, well, but if you do that, this could happen, and you just never see it because you're too close to it. I think it's really important to make sure you're getting your customers to really give you that feedback before you go live.
I still think we need to do a better job as an industry explaining to people what interest-based advertising is. I think it's really complicated. Even, I'm new to this industry really because I came out of retail and banking, and nobody outside this industry has heard anything about first party or third party. We have that same trouble in privacy sometimes. Like, we're all talking about the little ad icon, and Jules and I were talking about how stop a person on a street, they have no idea what you're talking about with the ad icon. They've never seen it. And that just seems so shocking to me that people haven't heard about that. But it's really important to maintain this trust, to not conflate online advertising with identity theft. Like, it drives me crazy when people do that. Online advertising doesn't have anything to do with identity theft. And I feel like we're missing an opportunity. You guys are all smart. You're not like boring lawyers who think in words, you think in pictures. You need to come up with a better way of explaining to people this complicated ecosystem to figure it out and to give them some options about it. And the options shouldn't just be, oh, don't track me anymore, or don't do, there shouldn't be fear about it. This should be a benefit. You don't want to pay an internet bill like a cable bill. There ought to be a way to explain it so people have trust and understanding, and they're willing to even give you more data. And one of the ways to think about it, again, is historically. Somebody asked me the other day, you remember back when people first came out with websites, and they're like, oh, well, should we have a website for our company? And then, fast forward, oh, should we have a page on Facebook? Ooh, that could be scary. It's interesting how it's really the same thing. It's the same questions that we've always had. It's just a different media. So, ooh, should we have a Twitter account? Ooh, should we have whatever the next thing is? Of course you should have those things. You should just figure out what your issues are with it. Interest-based advertising online isn't any different from the warranty cards that people filled out years ago with direct mail. It's the same exact thing. That's not scary. People fill those things out all the time, and then you have choices. So it's really the same thing, and it's getting people comfortable with it.
So let me leave you with 3, maybe 4 practical tips. Maybe you heard already this anonymous personal stuff. When I was the chief privacy officer at DoubleClick many years ago, I could say, hey, don't worry, it's anonymous, and it was fine. Today, when we're appending and we're targeting and we're adding third-party data and we can tailor your world and link you across devices, the European regulators, the advocates, none of them think that that's completely anonymous. So start using maybe a little more careful language. It's not explicitly personal. We take efforts not to carefully identify you. To the advocates, when you say, this is anonymous, they're like, bullshit. Hey, we know this guy, he can identify it. If you have enough data, they don't believe us. And so if we're a little bit more clear about, look, we get that we're tracking you, we're gonna give you some controls over it, we're gonna take steps to not explicitly identify you, we're in a much better place. Number one. Number two, I see all the time people saying, hey, it's just aggregated. It may be that your client is working with a UI that gives them only report level data, but you have individual level data. And I constantly read these policies and it says, we only share things that are aggregated, when very often the product maybe has a UI that's aggregated, but you're dealing with individual level data. If you mean non-personal, say so, but it might be individual. The other piece that I also see is this is an ecosystem, and if the stuff doesn't fit together, so your client says, hey, here's how I track, and click here to turn off behavioral ads. But now you do server-side targeting because you're testing whether your device fingerprinting works. Well, now they're out of compliance. They've just said, this is what turns off the tracking, but it no longer turns off what you've done. So if you're going to be doing something, making sure, here you are your brother's keeper. And even though you may not be the brand, you're like just the tail, it's the big client who ought to know, you're usually the one that knows the technology better. And in industry after industry, the vendor, the startup, the person rolling out, hey, it isn't even my data, is the one who ends up having to go to their clients and say, look, we understand this because we do this, so let us help you make sure that we're all integrated and that the entire ecosystem is compliant. Quick last thoughts. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it makes a huge difference to a publisher when the people in the ecosystem are upfront about what they're doing with the data. It's a huge difference. Feeling comfortable with your partners is really, really important. And it's a small community. People know when you're playing fast and loose with data. And so just don't do it. I mean, I think privacy, there's countless studies out there showing that focusing on privacy and focusing on data use makes customers want to work with you, makes you a better partner, being honest about what you're doing, explaining what the consumer is getting out of it. Those are such important things, and the people, the companies that do those things are going to be the ones who survive.
Richard, final thoughts?
I think by the end of the day, you wanted to run a sustainable business. It's not sort of you hit a run today. And I think the other things that we all talk about, it's really make value exchange very apparent. Transparency, obviously, it's very interesting for you to getting a lot of user data for you to provide actually better service, customized service to a certain extent. On the other hand, obviously that have the opportunity to monetize getting additional data. So make that value exchange transparent, easy to people understand. The other things I just wanted to put a couple of points. One point of data is not by any means, for example, identify information, but I think that if you can argue, for example, you have 30 those not sort of connect data points, but if you actually pull them all together, it could be actually very interesting, dangerous data points. So be very careful when you connect data, particularly if we share data with any third party or third party actually share data with you, offline, online, mobile, and when you pull all those scattered around data together, it could be actually getting to the point that you need to be very careful.
Should they all line up outside Aaron and start taking your number for audits now that we've kind of told people there's probably a lot of stuff they ought to be dealing with?
Privacy is not just about saying no. If you're talking to a lawyer or an advocate and they keep telling you not to do things, find someone else. Because really it's about getting that balance between if you have the trust of your customers and your users, they will give you more data. I mean, the Waze example is great. I could probably track my mileage with Waze, and I would give them more data because I like the app, I like what it does. And if they gave me a good reason, I'm sure, you take this extra data as well. So I think that transparency that you mentioned is so important. But privacy, you need to understand that there are some laws and there are some things that you can't do, but it's also making sure that the other side is that as long as your customers understand what you're doing, why, and they actually buy into that, you know, you're going to be one of those companies that survives and actually profits from it.
Wrap it up, Danon.
Just quick thoughts. You know, you're not alone in this world. There's a lot of experts out here. Aaron next to us will help you through PwC. Rich can help you at Trustee. There's a lot of other parties out there to help you sort through what your privacy practices are and should be, and has offers too even. Since we're not part of the revenue stream in the advertising ecosystem, we really can provide unbiased advice and support to you on how you should deal with some of the privacy and data security issues that come up. So feel free to reach out to us or anybody else and think about these issues, and I'm pretty sure the bar is open. So.
You'll find a ton of information at futureofprivacy.org, our website, and we're delighted to be working with Has Offers and the team. So lunch is next. Yes? Thank you all for your attention.